So my first question, is that true that all coups and revolutions that happened in Latin America in the past century, they happened with the participation of the USA and with the people who were prepared by the CIA or the American military?
Yes, I mean that's basically. I suppose you could find one or two exceptions, but by and large, historically, that is exactly correct. Virtually every single coup, either failed or successful in Latin America, and I'm glad we're talking about Latin America because it really is the birthplace of all of this, the proving ground. There was a certain training camp called the School of the Americas in the southern United States where generals and paramilitary and officers from several of the dictatorships in Latin America were brought for special training. And there was even there was a CIA handbook that became famous because it was leaked to the public in I think the late 80s, somewhere in the 80s, which was incredibly embarrassing because it was basically a blueprint for how to stage a coup. And it included, advice on torture and subverting the press and incredibly detailed things about how this works. And so when people say, it's silly, the left is...
It was a handbook for who?
For these officers, for CIA officers themselves, internally for the CIA, and then also for people whom they trained to conduct these operations in their own country. Because remember, like I was just about to say, when people say, well, it's crazy, it's a conspiracy theory to say that the CIA is behind everything. Well, of course, they have what they call plausible deniability, which is they are behind plenty of things themselves. They have a finger in every pie, so to speak. But they also train local militias, local paramilitaries. They find disaffected groups of officers in the actual military of a target country. They've done this twice already in Venezuela, and they're on their third try right now. What's happening in Venezuela is classic CIA operation. And they've been doing it for decades.
Okay, I see. We have already found the information about the so-called School of the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
It is situated in Georgia.
Yes, exactly.
The state of Georgia. Could you please tell us about it? Because as we know, it is existing since the end of the Second World War.
Right.
Is it right? And who is prepared there?
That's where, during the Second World War, the precursor to the CIA was called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And almost immediately afterwards, it was converted into this agency. And the School of the Americas was founded very quickly afterwards. And what happens there is that people are trained. This is CIA officers who are going to participate in it's a coup factory, basically. Officers who are going to be trained to participate in these operations, then military officers from the target countries, as I was saying, maybe political wings of fascist organizations or anti-left organizations in those countries, specifically. Well, it's hard to say specifically because it's almost every country in Latin America. You say Honduras, yes, there's been a coup there sponsored by the CIA. Nicaragua, yes, invaded by the CIA 7 times. The Dominican Republic, Haiti, Guatemala, Venezuela, it's El Salvador. They have all suffered this targeting. And the School of the Americas, it's been a high project for members of the anti-imperialist American left to shut down the School of the Americas. And what they do is they change tactics, they deny what's going on there, they try to change the agenda. One of the things they do is to hide their involvement. Like I said, this wasn't us. This was a spontaneous uprising of right-wing generals in Chile, for example. We had nothing to do with it. And then maybe 10 years later, You get the diplomatic cables where you actually had people from the CIA telling people what to do. This is our guy. Call this guy. Get him to do this. It's incredible when you wait 10 years. And the thing is that people on the ground, you don't have 10 years to wait. The people in Ukraine can't wait 10 years to decide whether or not this was a CIA coup. It fits the mold. It fits every element of it. And so you have to respond as if it is. It's not a courtroom. This is public opinion, and people's lives are at stake.
And on what do they work today? So what is their nowadays project, as we can call it?
Well, it's all clandestine. It's all very difficult and shadowy, But the open... there are two things I wanted to say. The open projects right now, the most obvious ones are regime change projects currently in Venezuela, Syria, and Ukraine. And these are, without question, this has been openly stated by the American political, not just the CIA, but the political establishment as well. And one of the things that I think is particularly dangerous or arrogant, or maybe it's a blessing, I don't know. During the Cold War, and then during the 70s and 80s, there were lots of these operations that were handled directly by the CIA or sometimes in cooperation with MI6, the British intelligence, or the Pakistani ISI, or the Mossad, Israeli intelligence, or a combination of these figures. And then there were all these shadowy, more recently you had these private mercenary armies like Blackwater and Greystone and things like that. But a shift that we've seen since the end of the Cold War is that a lot of this is happening not just through the CIA, but through the State Department itself. It's become open foreign policy. It wasn't this, Brennan went to Kiev later on, but who was it who was giving out cookies at Maidan? It was Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State. This is an amazing development that you have, what's the three-prong? You have John McCain show up, who's the senator, very important senator, and very well connected, even though he's not the party that's in power. But he has a long-standing connection to the foreign policy establishment. You have then the Secretary of State, John Kerry, who will come in and make and before him Hillary Clinton. Look what happened in Libya. This was an open case of regime change where you had the President of the United States saying, this is what we want to accomplish. And this is a far cry from, say, Arbenz, Latin America, or even the Sandinistas in the late 70s and all through the 80s, even Pinochet in 1973. All those were CIA-led operations and funded through the CIA, very discreetly. Sometimes they would get in trouble because it wasn't what the money was supposed to be used for. Now, who's going to tell the President of the United States? Who's going to tell Victoria Nuland? This is main budget money. This is the main act. And I think it's a very scary development. And I think it shows, if you're a thief, for example, you try to go at night, don't you? And you wear black and you go through a back door and you take something small at first to make sure they don't see you. You make sure there are no lights. This is what you do when you know you're stealing something. These people have become so drunk with their own power and so convinced of, what's the phrase? The indispensable nation. America is the only indispensable nation. And basically, the idea is that we can do whatever we want. And so you have thieves and criminals going around in broad daylight, like coming up to your bakery, bringing a truck and saying, this rack of bread is ours, we're taking it now. But what do you mean? Yeah, we just feel like it. And that is, I put it in such stark terms because I feel like that's how the rest of the world is starting to react. Starting to say, hey, wait a minute. When you were doing it in the dark, and we had to go and prove it, and it took us years to prove it because we didn't really know who was who, now they just waltz in and take what they want. I mean, Libya, they destroyed an entire country and pretended that the Americans had nothing to do with it. NATO didn't have that power. NATO didn't have all of the reconnaissance hardware and the drones and the intelligence apparatus. That was the Americans. It was a pure American operation from beginning to end, disguised as a NATO operation, which started, of course, in the CIA. But, you know.
Okay, now a report we're also telling about Panama, you know, December 1989.
Yes.
Yes, they say, they took control over Panama.
Yes.
So could you tell us something about it? Because, you know, many civilians, they were killed during this operation.
Yes.
In Panama.
There were many civilians. We will never know exactly how many because it was severely covered up. But Manuel Noriega was the latest in a series of criminals who were kind of propped up by the American regime. They were favorable to American interests. And he started to make noises that he wasn't going to play ball, you know. And this is how it always starts. This is probably what is happening with some pushback with Erdogan in Turkey or with Mubarak possibly in Egypt, etc., is that they have one of their own cronies who decides that they're not going to play ball anymore. So they decided that Manuel Noriega had to go. So what they did was they conducted this massive PR campaign where they branded him as a narcotraficante, a drug dealer. He was part of the cartels, and he had to go. He was evil. He was dangerous. Again, this is the beginning. Well, not the beginning, but that old phrase, to his own people. He was a danger to his own people. And the U.S., because the U.S. is the only protector of democracy and the only regime in the world that really understands democracy. And even if we have to force it down your throat, even if we have to kill your entire family so that you can vote for our chosen spy, we're doing the right thing because we know democracy. And so this is what happened. They decided that this man was wanted by the American authorities. It would be as if someone decided that Barack Obama was a terrorist, and that can be proven. You can say that he was involved in mass murder campaigns. There are a number of courts who would be willing on foreign soil to say that he was guilty and to come up with an indictment. But then you send 25,000 troops into a foreign country to go pick him up. Like, you know, instead of getting him to come to the police station, you invade the country to pick him up. Then, if there was a whole terror campaign where Noriega hid out in the embassy, I'm not sure which embassy it was, but it was a foreign embassy in Panama, and they surrounded it. They did all the things that they're doing now at Guantanamo Bay, with this massive noise campaign, you know, hyper loud rock music 24 hours a day to try to force him out. And it was an incredible spectacle. But remember, this is in 1989. This is when the Soviet Union was falling apart. The counterweight to this was very weak. And it was in the United States' own hemisphere. It's only a few countries away. You know, we have thousands and thousands of warships and troops and everything in the Pacific and in the Caribbean Sea. So there's no problem going to pick him up. Now, again, moving forward, the thing is that it's gotten so much worse. What does Syria have to do with the United States? What did Afghanistan have to do, or Iraq have to do with the United States? They made the justification going back to the Monroe Doctrine in 1825, where the U.S. decided everything that happens in our hemisphere is our business. We'll take care of it and you stay out. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was updated to every other country, everywhere in the world, all the time. And it was a very scary thing. Panama was actually within the confines of Latin America, at least. But what else were you going to ask me about Panama?
Yeah. And so, can we say that it was a battle for the Panama Canal, you know?
I'm sorry?
So for the Panama Canal.
Oh, absolutely. I think that Panama is not a country, by the way. You know that it's not, it was never an actual country. It was seized from Colombia in order to take control of the Panama Canal. And this is way back in 1901 or whenever that happened. It was something that was designed as a protectorate of the United States. And then they had a long-term contract where the American armed forces actually controlled and occupied the canal zone. And so, since this is such an enormous choke point of international commerce, all of these ships that have to move from one ocean to the other have to pass through the Panama Canal. So the Americans controlled the Panamanian Canal Zone for 50 years. And it was President Carter, who signed the treaty, which is an inevitability that this was supposed to end, that we're supposed to give this up, and the Panamanians are supposed to control their own thing. Well, that was part of the calculus that goes in there. Everyone was afraid of what would happen when the United States lost control of this. Now, here's an interesting caveat again. What's happening now, and this is why Panama fades into history, Libya even fades, even Ukraine will fade into history because of, say, the Chinese-Russian gas deal. There's another deal. The deal is between Nicaragua and Russia to create another canal across the isthmus, but through Nicaragua instead of through Panama. This is going to be an enormous, because Panama Canal has huge problems with it, right? There's a huge difference in height between the Pacific. You have to go through a series of locks. It has a very narrow restriction in terms of how wide the ships can be, and it has never, it's unchangeable. But because it was the only game in town, the Americans, which is to say the Panamanians, can control it. Now there will be competition, which is an amazing, I think is an incredible opportunity.
Yeah, and as I understand, during these years of the control, they got a lot of money, yes, billions of dollars, right?
Oh, absolutely, sure. Well, I mean, you have to have tolls, bribes, graft, corruption, call it whatever you want, but it is by virtue of the fact that they control it. Yes, yes, it is worth a lot of money to have that choke point in the international system.
Yeah, and could you please tell about the deaf troops, the deaf escadrons in Latin America? How were they formed?
Oh, the which troops? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Deaf.
Oh, death squads. Death squads. Yes. Death squads. It's interesting that the term death squads comes from the series of wars that started in, really with Pinochet in 1973 in Chile, but worked its way all throughout the continent and saw its major escalation and major use in what they called the Seven Sisters, the Central American republics in the 80s. After the attempt to overthrow the Sandinista revolution, which was in 1979, and that war lasted for 10 years. They never let up. What they did was they would hire groups and train, again through this School of the Americas or through some other means, these death squads, which were hyper-fascist, right-wing paramilitaries who had control to the major militaries of the country. Some of them were sponsored by local oligarchs, by generals and their families, wealthy families. But the point was they operated outside of the organized military structure. Nominally, they actually were part and parcel of the same thing. And so when people talk about Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and now Syria, what a lot of people call the Nutters Brigades, these jihadists who are going and cutting off people's heads, and you have to remember this is an American invention. This had its start in Latin America in the 70s and 80s, and these were absolutely brutal terror campaigns. Doing things like raping and killing nuns, shooting an archbishop as he conducted mass on the altar in his church. They were cutting off fingers of people who voted. If there used to be this system where you would have the purple thumb to show that you had voted, and they would go and cut off fingers of people to scare to. This is what happens if you vote. That sort of thing. They had Somoza in Nicaragua had his own army, the National Guard. National Guard, sound familiar? This Nadzgvardia is now being established in Ukraine, who would do things like force someone to swallow a button on a string and then pull it up constantly and force you to swallow it at gunpoint. You swallow it, they pull it up. It was one of these forms of torture. They would cut off women's breasts as they did awful things, like to kill people because they had given information away. They would cut off their genitals and stuff them in their mouths. I mean, just absolutely horrific things. There is nothing that's happening in the Middle East that didn't first happen in Latin America. And that's what you see, and the hope that I see is that Latin America now supports people's governments from, there are half a dozen from, Cuba to Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Nicaragua, who are actually coming to terms with that history. They went through maybe 20 years of civil war. There were hundreds of thousands of people who were killed. And slowly, the people were awakened, and now they are an enormous threat to American hegemony in its own backyard, which is, it's karma. That's what we call it.
After the Second World War, the NATO, they began the operation called Gladio.
Gladio,
yeah?
yes.
Yes, it was anti-communism operation.
Right.
And it was these organizations who were involved into this operation. They were consisted of real killers.
Yes, and also the just recruited former fascist killers. This is and so the Banderites and in Western Ukraine from Galicia, for example, made a principal part of these kinds of things. They found the die-hard supporters of Hitler and Nazi ideology in these countries and recruited them into this operation and set them against the communists from Greece and Yugoslavia, in Ukraine, all over the Eastern Bloc. And this was, I think the last time I talked to you, I mentioned the dichotomy in the State Department's ideology, where half of the people were saying, on to Moscow. We have to rearm the German army and fight on to Moscow. And for the mainstream public opinion, who was tired of war, and for the mainstream political establishment, who said we had just fought this vicious and destructive war for 4 years against fascism, and now we're going to rearm it sounded insane. And so they never gave up, and that was part of what they established immediately as a covert way of serving the same operation. All right, the people who pay us won't let us do the big thing, which is, bring 300 divisions of the former German army backed up by the U.S. and fight against Russia. So I guess we'll have to do it our way, which is operations like this. Operation Paperclip, where you had all of the former Nazi scientists coming into the military-industrial complex of the Western countries. And then Operation Gladio, which is taking the actual killers and putting them in the field in all of their former war zones. So it was almost as if the war never stopped. And that's exactly how it felt to millions of people in Yugoslavia and Ukraine and in Eastern Europe.
Okay, you have already told about it. Yes, that these death squads. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're still existing, and they're still existing in Syria, for example.
Yes.
So, and you have already talked about it, about what is happening in Syria now. And so, what do you think? Who will win in the so-called battle now in the Syria? Because it doesn't have any end.
Yes, and that's the point. Lubov, is the point is it for it not to have any end. You have to realize the psychopathology of the people who are organizing this campaign. I really think that they are clinical psychopaths, that they are so convinced of their ideology that they bring in people who are actually organized killers, and they're not interested in constructing anything. And their plan B is never actually about winning. They knew 2 years ago that they were never going to topple Bashar Assad. They knew, almost right away, right after they started. And it was a military death squad operation from the beginning. It was not a revolution. That's a fraud and a myth. But they exploited the disaffection in the country to launch this death squad army. And the reason I sound so sure about it is because we just talked about the 30, 40-year-old history in Latin America where these people were all, where they cut their teeth, so to speak. That was their playground, where they practiced their idea. That's how sick it is. They practiced the idea, they got good at it, they developed protocols and rules and... Hi. Did we get cut off?
Yes.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. Yes, I can. Yes. So, in Syria, the goal, very quickly, even though their stated goal was that Assad must go. And they continued this for a long time after, I think, the military planners decided that this wasn't going to happen. So when we say what's going to happen and it seems like it's never going to end, that is their point. That's their mission. What do? Now that they know that the Syrian army is too powerful, Russia is not going to end its support, Hezbollah is not going to end its support, they send in more weapons. And bigger quantities of weapons, more dangerous weapons. Even though it's a losing battle, the point is to destroy. And the point is to make it difficult. Make it difficult not only for the Syrian army and the Syrian people, whose country is half rubble, but for the Russians. This is a very clear... The only way to win in Syria was to turn it into Libya. Right? And the Russians, I have a lot of respect for President Putin and Premier Medvedev, but they made a very serious mistake in Libya in 2010 when the UN Security Council, when they abstained rather than vetoing and what does the West do when it sees a loophole? It drives 100,000 tanks and 5 battleships through. That is all they want, is that loophole. And when the no-fly zone became the UN Security Council resolution, they exploited that to start the war, which was completely illegal under the resolution. They completely manipulated and abused the authority given to them by the Security Council. But that was what they wanted. They wanted to do the same thing in Syria. And the Russians and the Chinese said, no, this isn't going to happen. You can't do this with UN authority. And not only that, you can't do it on your own either. If you remember clearly, there were 2 missiles shot down in the very first day of what was supposed to be this barrage. And then they had the Israelis come in and say that there was a test missile, or it was something, that was completely bogus. It was the beginning of that campaign. They wanted to see how serious the Russians were. The Russians helped them shoot down the missiles, and they said, no, no, not this time. We learned our lesson in Libya. And liberals in the United States all crow that it was President Obama had a change of heart, and that the pressure from the British Parliament, if you remember, the British Parliament voted against it, and then the U.S. Congress was about to vote against it, and so President Obama saw the wisdom, and so he backed down. It's because he's a good leader. That was complete crap. What always happens, and the only thing that happens, is a credible, effective military deterrent. And they saw, and their generals saw, that they would lose a lot of people and a lot of hardware and a lot of political goodwill if they proceeded with that. The only thing I'm completely convinced of this, the only thing that stopped them was the military deterrent offered by the Russians. And they've never forgiven them for that. They never will forgive them for that. That's what Ukraine is all about. And so what is going to happen in Syria is they're going to try to provoke and pin down Russia and Syria in this idiotic war with foreign mercenaries, completely foreign mercenaries. There's nothing indigenous about this at all. It's not a Syrian thing. It's not a civil war. It's an invasion. It's an invasion by death squads supported by the U.S. and funded through the Gulf, the Gulf monarchies, the Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And so when they decide that they're tired of it, or that it's too costly, then they will slowly stop and it will be over. But, like I said, they're not trying to win it.
And can we say that Ukraine is the next target of the USA? Yeah, we see it now.
Absolutely.
So what will happen there? So what is your...
I don't have a crystal ball, Lyubov. It's so sad because I see, as you watch it happen, it's very emotional. You know, I have friends and contacts and sources all throughout Donbass, and I've had people who have seen me interviewing or writing, and they think, oh, good, someone is speaking out about this. I have letters from Odessa, from people in Odessa saying, please tell the world that we're not lying. Please tell the world that we're not terrorists. And it almost makes me cry because it's the monopoly on the media in the West is so complete and the funding is so overwhelming. And look what's happening right now. Russia is trying very desperately not to get drawn in. And NATO absolutely wants Russia to come in so that they can have excuse to bring their own troops in so that they can basically make another Syria. And what happens is that you have these provocations are more and more ugly. You have the fascists in the West, the Poroshenko, what we call him. In Russian, Parasha means commode. So he's basically President Pot. And he and the junta have decided that since Russia is not going to intervene, or to the extent that Russia is not going to intervene, they have to kill and scare as many people as they can. They can't win, I don't think, unless they kill 500,000 people. They would have to kill, seriously, like a tenth of the people in the region. There are about 7 million people in Donbass. So they would have to kill a huge number of people, and they don't have the means to do it. They can make it ugly, but what is the junta going to do? The people despise them. You have these referenda. Even if you don't accept the validity of the referenda, they show you that everybody despises Kiev. They reject overwhelmingly rule from Kiev. Donbass is never, ever, ever going to be part of a united Ukraine in any sense that it was before November 2013. Ever. That is never going to happen. Whatever happens in the next, and again, take Syria, in the next 6 months or 6 years. We don't know. We don't know how many people they're going to try to kill to force that 11 size foot into a size 9 shoe, But it can't happen. And what Poroshenko proposed was, hours, not weeks? Remember in his one of his first speeches, he said that the problem in the East was that killers weren't being paid enough, right? There wasn't an incentive for 20-year-olds to go slaughter women and children because they weren't getting enough money. So if we give them 3,000 or 30,000 hryvnias a month, which is, I think, next month is going to be worth $5, but they'll be more likely. It'll be a motivator. Then they said it had to be more, what was the term he used? Efficient, which is creepy. That sounds like death squads, It means you have to use planes against people with no defense. You have to use helicopter gunships. You have to use Grad rocket launchers, howitzers, heavy artillery. And they're shelling hospitals, they're shelling schools, kindergartens, orphanages. There was an orphanages that was shelled today in Slavyansk. Just a truly sick thing. And what you see establishing itself all over Western Europe are small but growing areas of public protest. When Yatsenyuk or Turchinov, take your pick, doesn't matter, one of the puppets went to Aachen in Germany and was met with a very sizable protest with people saying, terrorist, fascist, we don't want Kiev Nazis in Germany, etc., demanding that their governments do something. There was one in Nicosia today, there was one in Milan today, there are some in Spain. So there is a growing movement knowing what they're doing. So time is not on the side of the junta. But that said, again, I have to say I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know the difference between 6 months and 6 years. I do feel this. They can't win. At the end of whatever time period that is, Donbass, Novorossiya, Donetskaya Narodная Respublika, whatever it is that results from this, will be either an independent state with close ties to Russia, some sort of autonomous republic within Russia. I think that's probably the least likely, or an autonomous republic within some sort of largely federated Ukraine. See, what the United States did, probably on purpose, is that they ignored Ukraine 101. First rule in Ukraine 101, the rule of trying to figure out anything to do in Ukraine is the East-West divide. Don't force one half of the country, don't force the whole country to swallow what only one half of the country wants. Because it's very, very tenaciously, very, very precariously divided. And people in the West can do what they want, and it's not cut and dried. I mean, there are divisions in all areas of the country, but that's the general rule that has kept Ukraine from sinking further into chaos since 1991. Is rule number one: don't force the whole country to do what only half the country wants. The U.S. decided that it was time to do that. And Poroshenko feels that he can do so with impunity. And if he's doing anything, I don't even know if the guy makes a decision on whether to tie his shoes in the morning. I mean, this is clearly a U.S. operation. And I think that if you move from anywhere between 6 months and 6 years, let's look, if you're trying to figure out what's going to happen. Between 6 months and 6 years, you will have the natural disintegration, which is, oh my God, we have no pensions anymore. We have no jobs anymore. There's no higher education anymore. There's no health care anymore. We're giving our mines and our power stations and our gas resources are being sold off to foreign companies. This is austerity. This is austerity and death, the only two things that NATO and the IMF have to offer. And so, just like the long-term effects of the end of the petrodollar, the enormous gas deal between Russia and China and the new security alliance, the second canal through Nicaragua being built by Russia and China, all these things are the long-term consequences. And if you zoom in again to Ukraine, say 6 months, a year and a half, you will have an enormous disaffection with everything that had to do with Maidan. You already do, right? This is happening right now, today, in Kiev. You have the Maidanites who are being dismantled, burning tires, shooting, getting in, refusing to leave, because this isn't quite what they asked for. Have you seen pictures of Yanukovych and Poroshenko side by side? They're like twins. They could have been exactly the same. So they got rid of this one oligarch. Why? What was the main thing that started this was because he backed down on signing the EU association agreement. Remember? He said, and he didn't say he refused. He said, we need to think about this because this doesn't look like that good a deal. Yesterday, Poroshenko said that we need more time to think about this. 5 days after he was elected. Suppose elected, if you call that an election. But see, that's, it's amazing. And of course, to be fair to the well-meaning people who stood up at Maidan, not knowing that they were being used by the CIA and the fascists, they wanted an end to oligarchy. They wanted the end to the plundering of their country. And what they got was exactly the opposite. So those, I think you'll have some sort of an actual increase in understanding between East and West. That people saying, oh, you know what? Maybe those people really aren't our enemies. Maybe they're all just other Ukrainians like we always thought all along. They just speak a different language. They have different ideas. And we have a lot in common, which is we both want the end to the oligarchy. That's being very hopeful, Lubov. I don't know.
Okay, Mr. Welch, thank you very much for this very interesting interview.
Thank you.
It was great.
Okay.
I hope to see you again one day.
Okay. Well, I'll keep an open line. Thank you.
Have a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye now.